implicature. And we also talked about conversational implicature, right? Remember these two terms? Both of them are implicatures, okay? So you have two types of implicature. You have conventional implicature and also conversational implicature, right? And the conventional implicature is what we call the not important new information, right? Entailment is new information and also is important, right? Not important, another term for it is not at issue, right? Not at issue meaning it's not something that is important, right? But it's new information, right? And we also talked about conversational, so conversational implicature, which arises out of some relationship with, remember, Grice's maxims, right? So in order to get that implied meaning, you need to do something to the Grice's maxim, like maxim of quantity, quality, relevance, and also maxim of manner. Right? Today, I'll look into what we didn't finish last time, which is conventional implicature of some contrastive markers in English. Okay? So you have this on the handout from last time, which is on the screen here. So last time we looked at the implicature. If you look at the page before that, I presented to you this kind of conventional implicature, right? The use of "aoso" in Korean and the use of "go," right? If you look at the difference when you use the "so," "aoso," the "aoso" here, you know, 친구를 만나다, and 친구하고, and then 같이 영화를 보다. So you see that this is in the parentheses. When you use "aoso" here, it implies that you went to the movie with your friend. So that's the conventional implicature when you use the "so." But when you use the "go," it implies that you know you parted ways with your friend already, and then you went to the movie by yourself. So that's what Korean people have in mind when they use the "aoso" and the "go" in kind of more or less the same situation. So that's what we call conventional implicature. Okay. And so today we'll look at the conventional implicature of English contrastive markers. You'll see that on this page, you'll see 1, 2, 3, three main groups of circles, right? You see this is the first one, which is the biggest one, and then the second group is here, and the third group is here, right? So what does this mean? This means that you can use, they are mutually exclusive, meaning things that are in the same circle have the same, more or less the same meaning. Whereas things that are in different circles, they have different meanings. Okay? So you cannot substitute one for another, right? So this is one circle, and that circle has a different meaning than the circle of instead, or the circle of rather, or the circle of on the contrary. So you can say that they have nothing to do with each other. Even though they all are what we call contrastive markers, they indicate contrast in some way, right? But they are not like mutually compatible. But within the same circle though, like you will see this one, right, the biggest one. Within the same circle, you see many levels, right, of the same thing. So starting from but here, and then inside we have however and nevertheless, and on the other hand, you can see that but here is in like a bigger circle than in comparison or conversely. So that means that but is kind of more universal, contrastive marker than other ones, right? And other ones have like more restriction than the use of but. So but here, if you want to use but to indicate contrast, it's more or less universal. And it's more universal than conversely, for example, right? So but could be used in more or less all situations, but other things like in comparison or in contrast, or on the other hand, they have specific cases that you have to know in order to be able to use them. And sometimes, so but can be used in place of on the other hand, but not the other way around, okay? So in other words, if you want to use the other hand, you can use but, right? But not the other way around. Now, let's look at some examples. So again, these groups, like this group, and this group, they are mutually exclusive, meaning that they cannot co-occur, okay? One cannot substitute for another. So if you look at these examples, if you look at example 1, Ha-young didn't walk to school. On the contrary, she rode in a limo, like this. Now, you can see that but doesn't work here. Okay, but doesn't work here. Because as you can see, they belong to different circles, right? So you cannot substitute one for the other. But in this case, you have to use the contrary, right? So in this case, the contrary intends that the let's say there are two messages, okay? I'll call them S1 and S2. S1 is the first message, which is Ha-young didn't walk to school, okay? That's S1. I will call that S1. S2 is she rode in a limo, okay? So that's S2. When you use the on the contrary, S2 has to be correct, and S1 has to be false. So in other words, it's not just a simple contrast, okay? Unlike but, okay? But suggests just simple contrast. But when you use on the contrary, it means that S2 is correct, but S1 is false. That's the implicature. So when a speaker uses on the contrary, he implies that the first statement is false. Not just contrastive, but is false, is wrong. But S2 is the correct one, and he wants to correct S1 with S2 in that case, okay? So this one is false, the first statement, S1 is false, the second one is right. That's the implicature that on the contrary conveys, okay? So not just simple contrast, but wrong and right, okay? In the second one, we didn't leave late, but we arrived late. In this case, you can use but, and you cannot use on the contrary. Because here, it's not that the first one is wrong, but it's just the word is not right. So it's not the whole statement that's wrong, but it's just one word that's not right, right? So that's on the contrary and but. In the third one, Seung-ryong didn't get out of bed this morning. Instead, he went back to sleep. You cannot use but here. Why? Because but and instead cannot be substituted for each other, right? They belong to different circles. And also, when you use instead, where is it? When you use instead suggests that you accept S1, okay? So when you use instead, you accept S1. So S1 is correct, and S2, this is for instead, okay? S1 is correct, and S2 provide more information on S1 in terms of what happened, what really happened. So you can see that it's different, right? Because when you use on the contrary, this is on the contrary. S1 is wrong, S2 is right. And the speaker wants to correct S1, right? The whole thing is wrong. But when you use instead, S1 is accepted, meaning S1 is right, but S2 provides more information as to what really happened. Like this, S1 is correct, he didn't get out of bed, the speaker accepts it, and instead he went back to sleep. So the second one provides more information on the first one, right? As to what happened. So you can use instead there. And number 4, I assure you Gil-ho will not be late. Instead, he'll be early. Same thing. S1 is accepted. S1 is right that he will not be late. And S2 provides more information about what happened or what will happen. He will be early, like that. So you can see the different situations between the two markers, right? But instead, but and instead. Let's see, number 5, New York used to be a nice city. On the other hand, or however, today it stinks. You cannot use on the other hand here, and you have to use however or but, okay, in this case. Why? Because on the other hand, this is a different one. On the other hand indicates that you have an alternative on the same topic. Okay. On the other hand, meaning you should look at S2 as an alternative to S1. So S1 and S2. S2 is an alternative of S1, meaning that S1 and S2 are two sides of the same coin. Okay. Not necessarily contrastive in the strictest sense. Okay. Not necessarily S1 and S2 are the opposite, not like that. But when you use on the other hand, right, it implies that S1 and S2 are two ways of looking at the same situation, but not necessarily opposite, right? Not necessarily opposite, but two ways of looking at the same situation. Let's see, for example, I could say, I like a job that pays more, right? I'd like to have a job that pays more. And then you can use on the other hand here. On the other hand, you can use on the other hand there. Because these are two sides of the same coin, right? You are talking about your job right now. And one way of looking at it is you don't like it because it implies that the opposite side, which is it pays maybe the pay is very low, whereas on the other side you like your current job right now. So it's like looking at the same thing from two different viewpoints, okay? But not necessarily the right, like the real opposite of each other. Okay? So you can see that each marker is different in terms of what it implies. Okay? Not the same, so they cannot be used like interchangeably. And then we have number 6. There was no reliable evidence of his guilt, but on the contrary, considerable proof of innocence. And number 5, Saw In-guk is rather tall, but in contrast, Krista is short, and so on. So these are things that I can show you that you know, there are different markers that cannot be substituted for each other. But in this case, you can have no but the main job of but is not to indicate contrast. But the main job here lies on in contrast, on the contrary, and nevertheless, and so on. Okay? And with time, you'll be able to distinguish between these markers. And as you go on, as you continue in your studies. Maybe at this time, it's rather difficult as to distinguish between the subtle the conventional implicatures that each one might suggest, but with time. But this is just the beginning. Okay. Let's see. Here on the other side, we haven't talked about but. The case of but is that the word but itself, you see that it's in the biggest group of circles, right? And the word but itself suggests any kind of contrast at all, but simple contrast, okay? But the nature of S1 and S2 could be different. S1 and S2, the nature of contrast could be direct contrast, indirect contrast, entailed message, presupposed message, or implicature. So but has the most variety of uses here. Like 10 to 16, you can see that the word but itself suggests contrast with different natures. John is tall, but Sam is short. This is most straightforward, right? You're talking about tall and short. That's direct contrast. But suggests direct contrast there. But number 11, Sam is short, but Harry is short too, like this. You can see that it's not like number 10 in that it's not short and tall, but here in 11 it's short and short. But what is contrasted is the word too, right? So that's like more indirect contrast. Same as 12 and 13. In 12 you have Tim is not short, but Max is not short either, right? So there seems to be no contrast here because it's not short and not short. But what is being contrasted is the word either, okay, which is indirect. Number 13, 2, which is the indirect contrast. 14 and 15, the use of but here is what we call the protest but. Protest meaning somebody just want to offer a different point of view. Okay? Here's a triangle, but this has 4 sides, right? So but here is the protesting but. And here there's the king of China is bald. Nam says, but there's no king of China. So that's the protest but. Okay? And number 16, we talk about this, right? Park Geun-hye is a politician, but she is honest. What is being contrasted here is the implicature, right? The conventional implicature that a politician is not honest, right? So that's what it contrasts. So that's the use of but. So but signals contrast, but the nature of contrast could be different. Like could be direct contrast, indirect contrast, or could be the protest but, or could be the implicature that's being contested. Next one, you have the other circle, you have however, right? If you look at the circle here, however is inside, right? Kind of is more towards the center than but. So you can see this means that however has more restrictions than but, okay? And that restriction lies in the fact that you cannot use however to do a protest, okay? However cannot be used like number 14 and 15. Like you cannot use however to make a protest, like protestive statement. Like number 18, Tasom is enjoying being a bachelor. Bachelor means a single male, okay? So if somebody wants to protest that statement, you have to use but to protest that statement rather than however, okay? The same goes for number 19. You should not use or however doesn't really work here, but is the best, okay? Because it's a protest but, okay? And nevertheless, which shares the same area as however, nevertheless is more or less like however, but you use nevertheless when the contrast is expected, right? So if there's some expectation, you use nevertheless, okay? In number 20, John is tall, nevertheless, Sam is short. You cannot do that because there's no expectation that Sam has to be short. So you just use however or but, okay? And you cannot use on the contrary here, right? Because on the contrary, it has to be the same topic, right? And same person, right? So nevertheless doesn't work here because there's no expectation that Sam has to be short. But in 21, you can use nevertheless. We started late, so the expectation, the expectation, the implicature, the expectation is we should arrive late too, right? In this case, it's the opposite. Nevertheless, we arrive on time. So it contrasts that expectation, right? So when there's an expectation and you want to indicate contrast, then you can use nevertheless. Same as in 22 and same as in 23. Harry is a politician, so the implicature, the conventional implicature is he is dishonest. But here you want to indicate that he is honest, so you can use nevertheless. So as long as there's expectation, you can use nevertheless, okay? If not, then you use but, okay? Same as in number 23. Okay, because there's expectation that the student that student hopes to get an A, right? And then the group, on the other hand, in contrast and in comparison that we just talked about, when we use on the other hand, I just said that you have to have the same topic and you look at the same topic from two different points of view, right? And you might have heard of another phrase which is on the one hand. You can have that phrase like on the one hand, I like a job that pays more. On the other hand, I like my current job. You don't need to have that, right? You don't have to say on the one hand. You just use on the other hand, okay? So it's like you have two hands, right? One hand and the other hand, and you're looking at the same thing from two different perspectives, right? Finally, on the contrary, we talked about that is used when the speaker intends to explicit the message to be correct, while the first one to be false. And then instead, and rather, we talked about that instead is used to suggest that S2 goes along the same line of argument, and S1 is correct, but S2 provides more information about S1, okay? So I'm not going to be focusing on this too much because it's really a difficult subject, and not everybody agrees on the same use of nevertheless or however. There are some weird cases where native speakers do not even agree as to whether a marker, a contrastive marker, will work in a particular situation. But this is for you to be aware, and the message for you to take home is that a lot of things are not mutually exclusive, meaning this circle is different from this circle and this circle, so you cannot use them interchangeably, okay? And there are specific cases why we should use nevertheless or however, and in other cases, we have to use but rather than other markers. So this is the message for you to take home on that. And you would think English is difficult, right? Because why does one thing has many functions? So you might be saying, well, English is too difficult. But in fact, Korean is also difficult. So this, I would just bring up one marker, one contrastive marker, and it has so many uses. The use of nne, or nde, right? So it depends on what type of verb you have. If you have an action verb, you have to add nde after the verb. if you have the adjectival verbs, depending on whether you have a bachim or not, if you have a bachim unne without the bachim plus just n. And so this is just a matter of form. So you have to know first, right, when you study Korean, whether it's a real verb, action verb, or whether it's an adjectival verb, right? And now you look at the many uses. The first use is to explain the background or the situation before making a suggestion, a request, or a question. So the S2, second statement has to be a suggestion, request, or a question like this. Tomorrow is Sunday. What are you going to do? So you use unne here to suggest something. There must be some conventional implicature there. So maybe the speaker expects that since it's Sunday, you are supposed to do something like that. But I'm not sure. I'm not a native speaker of Korean, so you guys know better than me why you use unne there, right? Rather than ieo, right? Or the second use, explaining the situation before explaining what happened. So S2 here is not a request or it's not a question, but it's like just a description of what happened. Like when I was sleeping yesterday, like here, nunne, and there's a phone call from Korea, like that. Why do you use nunne there, right? Instead of just 있었어요, whatever, okay? Or the third one, showing that the result of the situation is the opposite of maybe contrastive with what happened. It's still 9 o'clock, but I'm ready, sleepy. So this is the contrastive use of nunne, right? So I understand this, but I didn't understand the other two. And then you can use it to ask a question, like 지금 어디에 있는데, like that. So I mean, there are so many uses, and each one implies a different thing, and they're never clear or expect an answer or response. Now, I'm busy now, so like that. So here, there are so many uses of this, and in Korean classes, they're never clear as to which situation nunde is used to communicate what. So in this case, I'm a student now, and I'm also working. I'm not sure as to what nunde is trying to imply here. Is it the but, is it the and, or is it the because? Because there are so many uses, right? So I'm still studying. So as you can see, just a marker like nunne can be very difficult to foreigners, just like the contrastive markers but, and nevertheless, and in contrast, and so on. Okay? But I believe that Korean native speaker of Korean know this by heart. So anyway, I just want to show you that a particular marker like nunne or but or nevertheless can give you many implied messages, okay, depending on the context. What we want to do now is to do a review of all the types of meaning that we study. And I know that this topic is rather difficult, so I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, because I've learned directly or indirectly that some people still have no clue, have no ideas what we talked about in class. So I see the need to go over it one more time. So here I want to kind of summarize what we have talked about so far. This topic has to do with meaning, right? Pragmaticness and meaning. So we asked the question, what does it mean to understand a sentence? How do we understand a sentence? Of course, the answer is, well, you have to understand the meaning, right? Because that's what it means when we understand the sentence. So we know the meaning of the sentence. How? What type of meaning do we know? When we know under what circumstances is true and we understand the words, which is entailment, right? First, to understand the sentence, you need to know all the words, right? And you need to know what a word entails, right? What a word includes in the meaning. Like the word bachelor, for example, it includes the fact that someone is single and someone is male, like that, right? So in order to understand the meaning of a sentence, you have to know the meaning of each word, right? So that's the first step, which is what we talked about when we talked about entailment, right? Or when we talked about the word assassinate, you have to know that it means to kill, right? And there is some secret action of killing, right? And the target person is kind of a celebrity or somebody well-known, like that, right? And to kill here means that that person is dead. So when you read a sentence with the word assassinate, you have to know all the information here. So that's the first step to knowing the meaning of a sentence. You have to know the meaning of the individual words in a sentence. And that's what we call entailment, right? And the word entailment means that it's already included, meaning when you use the word bachelor, it has to be a single male. It cannot be a woman, cannot. So the entailment is what follows logically from the use of the word, okay? And they can never be contrasts, okay? Or else there is some weird logical contradiction, okay? And then the second thing that we know is when we know what the speakers may assume in the background, and that's what we call presupposition, right? So when you read a sentence, you can assume, you will know that a speaker has something in the background, okay? My car, if I say my car broke down this morning. In this case, when I say my car broke down this morning, my intention is just to tell you what happened this morning, okay? But that message already include my assumption that I have a car, right? Because I said my car there. So that is the background assumption that I don't even have to say, but you can understand that message when I say my car broke down this morning. So that's what we call presupposition. So presupposition is something that you don't even have to say, but it's already assumed by the speaker. And you can arrive at that assumption by looking at some maybe words or some expression like my. It means that that thing exists, for example. Okay? So that's the second type of meaning that you need to understand when you look at a sentence, right? The third type of meaning is what we call implicature. When we understand a sentence, when we know how speakers can exploit the unwritten rule of conversation that has to do with Grice's maxims, right? Maxim of relation, manner, and so on, right? And that meaning has nothing to do with logic. That meaning has nothing to do with the assumption, but it has to do with the violation of the maxim or the flouting of the maxim, and so on. And this diagram that you see here is like the summary of what we have talked about so far. So if you want to know what kind of meaning you have, whether you have entailment, presupposition, or implicature, you can do some tests, okay? So the implicature, this is what we talked about before. The implicature can be defeated or can be canceled, okay? Because the implicature is the meaning that has nothing to do with logic or has nothing to do with the background assumption. So it can always be canceled or refuted. If it can be canceled, then that's the implicature. Okay? If it cannot be canceled, then you have two types. You have either the presupposition or the entailment. Okay? So, like, Tasom is a bachelor. She is female. Here, this can never be an entailment, right? Because bachelor, again, has to be male and single. So when you have something like this, it can never be an entailment, okay? Because it's not defeasible, okay? You cannot contradict the entailment. So when you contradict it, the entailment, then something weird happens, like this is weird. It cannot be true, okay? But the presupposition but the implicature can be defeated. Okay? So, like this one, Krista used to smoke, let's say 10 cigarettes a day. Okay? Now, the implicature might be, I said might be, the implicature might be nowadays he no longer smokes. That might be one of the possible implicatures, okay? Because when you talk about the past, it's usually assumed, right? It's usually assumed that the past is different from nowadays. Okay? That's one of the possible implicatures. But again, an implicature can always be canceled. Okay? You can always say, and he still does, without causing any logical contradiction, logical weirdness. Because used to, the word used to, only says about things in the past. It doesn't entail that the present is different. It doesn't entail that. It doesn't necessarily entail that. Okay? So you can always say, you can always refute it, okay? If it's an implicature. The entailment, on the other hand, the entailment of this one is Krista smoked in the past. That's the exact entailment. Okay? Used to means to do things regularly in the past. So that's the entailment. But it doesn't mean that nowadays I don't do it anymore. Okay? Even though that can be one of the implicatures. Okay? So if it cannot be defeated, then you have either presupposition or you have the entailment. The presupposition and entailment are close, okay? But they can be distinguished by the fact that for the presupposition, it stays on regardless of what perspective you say it from, okay? But the entailment doesn't stay on. Okay? Let's say I use the same example. My car maybe, no, not that one. Let me use this one. The King of France is coming to Hanyang tomorrow. The King of France is coming to Hanyang tomorrow. So the message is just telling you what will happen tomorrow, right? But the background assumption, which we call presupposition, is that that King of France exists, right? There exists a King of France. Okay? That's the presupposition. Okay? Now, what's especially different about presupposition is that you can say the same sentence from different perspectives, and that presupposition is still there. For example, if you say, King of France is not coming tomorrow, still, whether you negate it or not, still, it presupposes that the King of France exists. Okay? Or you can ask, will the King of France come tomorrow, to visit tomorrow? Right? You are not even sure that he will come or not. But the background assumption is there's such a person who will or will not come, right? Still. So when there is this kind of implied message, okay, we call it a presupposition. And it's a special kind because it's assumed in the background. And that assumption, because it's already assumed in the background, will always stay in place, regardless of whether you doubt it, whether you negate it, or whether you just tell it as a message. Okay? On the other hand, the entailment will not stay. The entailment will not stay if the message is different. Okay? Like the King of France is not coming tomorrow. The King of France is not coming tomorrow. The entailment is not there exists a King of France, because it doesn't stay, right? The King of France is not coming tomorrow because there's no King of France, right? So the entailment doesn't stay, right? The entailment doesn't stay. Only the presupposition stays. So because this stays, then it's the presupposition, but not entailment. And then towards the bottom of the handout, I kind of summarizes. There is a summary of each type of meaning, and you can look at the example and you can look at the messages that they want to convey. Let's see. And then there's also on the second page the implicature. We talked about conventional implicature and conversational implicature, right? And there are two kinds, as you know, conventional and conversational. Conversational has to do with the maxims, and conventional doesn't have to do with the maxim. Okay? What I want to do now, though, is to do practice on the last page. So, can you examine the relationship between the two sentences, whether the first one entails or presupposes the other? Okay? Now, what you need to test is the difference between the entailment and the presupposition, right? Presupposition, always remember, the presupposition stays on. It will stays on. It will stay on. And it stays on despite the negation, despite the question, despite the modal version that you have. But the entailment doesn't stay on. Okay? And the entailment has to always be true. In every situation, let's say S1 is true. S2 has to always be true. No exception, because that's the logical conclusion. Now, in number 1, Lee smokes and drinks, and then the second statement is Lee drinks. Is the second one an entailment of the first one or not? In every situation where Lee, in every situation where he drinks and smokes, it has to always be true that he drinks. Is that true or not? If that's true, then you have an entailment. If there's an exception that he doesn't drink, then it's not an entailment, because entailment is a necessary relationship. So is that true or not? In every situation when E smokes and drinks, is it true that he must drink? Yes, right? Of course, when he both smoke and drink, then of course he must drink too. So this is an entailment of the first one. And what about the presupposition? Is it a presupposition of that? Is Lee drink a presupposition of Lee smokes and drink? Well, the presupposition has to stay on when you negate it, when you make it into a question, or when you modelize it. So when you say perhaps is a modal, right? Perhaps Lee smokes and drink, or does Lee smoke and drink? Does the statement Lee drinks stay? No, it doesn't, right? Because when you make it into a question, you are not even sure that does Lee smoke and drink? You're not even sure that he smokes or drink, right? So this doesn't stay, so no presupposition. Number 2, Krista and Peter are middle-aged, and is it always true that Peter is middle-aged? In all situations when it's true that Krista and Peter are middle-aged, it has to be that Peter is middle-aged. Yes? Yes, right? If both are middle-aged, then one has to be middle-aged too, right? So it's an entailment of the first one. And as for the presupposition, you can ask the question, are Peter and Krista middle-aged? Or perhaps Peter and Krista are middle-aged. You're not even sure. So this sentence doesn't stay on, right? When you modelize it or when you ask a question out of that statement. So there's no presupposition there. Number 3, people are not aware that Krista is old and Krista is old. Is this necessarily true? So in every situation, in all situations where people are not aware that Krista is old, it has to be true that Krista is old or not. In all situations when people are not aware, meaning when people don't know that Krista is true, is it always true that Krista has to be old? Yes or not? Think carefully. In all situations where people are not aware that he is old, must it be that he is old? Must it be that? If people are not aware, must it be that that is a fact? Think carefully. Is it necessary, or is it 100% Krista is old when people are not aware? Yes or no? People can be unaware because they don't know or it's not true. Can it be like that? This is not an entailment of, Chris died so is not an entailment of that sentence, of the first sentence. Because people are not aware, because Krista is not old. Krista is young. So people are not aware that he is old. Right? It could be like that, because people are not aware because the fact is different. So people don't have that awareness, of course, because the fact is different. The fact is not Krista is old. The fact is Krista is young, for example. Okay? So it's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that Krista is old. Okay? But to be an entailment, it has to always be the case, no exception, right? But is it a presupposition though? Can you ask the question out of that? Perhaps people are not aware that Krista is old, or are people aware that Krista is old? The presupposition of the speaker is, yes, Krista is old, right? When you ask a question, are people aware that Krista is old? Or perhaps people are not aware that Krista is old. The speaker already assumes that Krista is old. Okay? But that assumption is not necessarily the fact that follows from the sentence, right? So now you see clearly the difference between entailment and presupposition. The entailment has to be the necessary relationship. And Krista is old is not what the sentence means, okay? It's not what the sentence means. But Krista is old is what the speaker assumes to be true. So now you see clearly the difference between entailment and presupposition. So don't mess up two different types of meaning. Okay? Let's do number 6 together, and I'll give you time to do other questions. Number 6, that Gyu-ho eats a lot shocked Krista. And we have 3 statements there. Krista is animate, Gyu-ho eats a lot, and that Gyu-ho eats a lot caused shock in Krista. So what kind of relationship does the original statement have with other statements? So in the first one, Krista is animate. Is that entailed by the statement that Gyu-ho eats a lot shocked Krista? And you know animate, right? A living thing, a living being. So is that an entailment of the original statement that Gyu-ho eats a lot shocked Krista? In all cases where the fact that Gyu-ho eats a lot shocked Krista, Krista has to be animate always, or not? Krista has to be a living being, or not? When the amount that he eats shocked Krista, so Krista has to be an animate thing, animate being, or not? Yes or no? In all cases, or not? Yes, right? Because how could a table, how could the blackboard get shocked? Right? No. So a thing that can get shocked has to be animate. So in the first one, Krista is animate, is entailed by the statement, the original statement, shock, right? Because shock is to cause fear in a living being, right? So you know the meaning. And it's also presupposed, right? If you make it into a question, did the fact that Gyu-ho eat a lot shock Krista? Still, Krista is an animate, right, being. So it's both presupposes and entails. Krista is animate. What about Gyu-ho eats a lot? Is that an entailment of the original statement? Yes, right? In all situations, when Gyu-ho eats a lot, shock Krista, then it means it entails that Gyu-ho eats a lot, right? No exception. And it also presupposes that message, okay? So both. And the last one, that Gil-ho eats a lot caused shock in Krista. Is it entailed by the original statement? Yes, right? Yes, because it says more or less the same thing, right? To shock someone means to cause shock to someone, right? So it means almost the same thing. So in this case, then it entails it, right? But it doesn't presuppose it, because when you negate it, that Gil-ho eats a lot didn't shock Krista, then that certainly doesn't stay. Okay. So can you do, for 5 minutes, can you do number 4, 5, 7, 8, and 9, and 10? So think about whether it's, for entailment, it's a necessary relationship. So is it always true or not that S2 is the case? Okay, so let's look at number 10, because that will point out the difference between presupposition and entailment. Number 10, if Jun-sung's girlfriend discovers that he is a womanizer, she would ditch him. You know, womanizer, right? A person who is promiscuous, you know, promiscuous? Promiscuous. A person who has so many girlfriends like that, so many relationships at the same time. So promiscuous. So if Jun-sung's girlfriend discovers that he is a womanizer, you know, woman, right? Nicer. Ice is to make. So to make many women his girlfriends like that. She would ditch him meaning like kick him off, okay? So that statement, where is that? Number 10, that statement, Jun-sung is a womanizer is true or not, is always true or not. Does it always follow from the if clause? If Jun-sung's girlfriend discovers, meaning to find out the fact that he is a womanizer, she would ditch him. Is it always or is it necessarily true that he's a womanizer? If it's always true, then it's an entailment. Is it always true or not? If she finds out the fact that he's a womanizer, then she would ditch him. And is it always true that he's a womanizer? No, right? No. This is not an entailment, because he might not be a womanizer, right? But we know that if she finds that out, then he would ditch him for sure. But it doesn't mean that he is necessarily a womanizer. But if she finds out, right? If she discovers that. So it's not necessarily an entailment. So when you see the if clause, this thing inside the if clause is not necessarily true. You know only the if. You know only the condition, but you don't know whether that's a fact or not. You know for sure that if she finds out that he is a womanizer, right, she would ditch him, but not necessarily that he's a womanizer in real life or in this educational setting. And is it presupposed? Is it presupposed? Yes, it's presupposed, because when you negate it, Jun-sung, let's say, if Jun-sung's girlfriend doesn't discover that he's a womanizer, right? Jun-sung's girlfriend doesn't discover he's a womanizer, or Jun-sung's girlfriend discover he's a womanizer, still the presupposition that he's a womanizer stands, right? Still it stands. Or you can ask a question, does Jun-sung's girlfriend discover he is a womanizer? Still, it's there, right? The fact that he is a womanizer is there, regardless of whether you negate it, you put it into a question, or you modelize it. Perhaps Jun-sung's girlfriend discovers that he is a womanizer. Still, the statement that he's a womanizer stands no matter what you do to the original sentence. So if it stands, then it's a presupposition of the speaker, but not necessarily the literal meaning of the sentence. You have a question? Questions? Any questions? So now you can see the difference between entailment and presupposition. So the entailment is the necessary relationship between the meaning, the real meaning, the literal meaning of the statement and the logical consequence, but the presupposition is what the speaker has in mind. So here, regardless of whether he doesn't believe it, regardless of whether he asks a question out of it or he is not sure about it, still he believes that that's true. Okay? The speaker believes that that's true, but not necessarily the literal meaning of the sentence. So can you do the rest, and then we can come back on Monday. It's Monday, right? Because this Wednesday we don't have class. So come back on Monday and we'll do this.